So have you always been a bit...
Obsessed? Yeah, the problem's all I've ever known. All any of us have ever known. That's not okay, so I want to find out.
What?
Everything.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Haunting the Narrative. I'm your host for this episode. My name is Natasha. If you're looking for me on the internet, you'll find me under the name Hell Chi. And tonight I am joined by...
Meg. You can find me on AO3 at Menina123, and you can find me on Tumblr at Menina89.
And I'm Mairead, and you just can't find me. I'm opting out. No, I'm being stupid as usual. Woman in Winter on Tumblr, Savror Fair on AO3. I'll be honest, I just forgot my URLs.
It happens to the best of us.
Particularly at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, if anybody's wondering, I know we've mentioned this a lot of times because we complain about it, but yeah, me and May are up until like 11 or midnight recording these things.
I'm old. Past my bedtime.
These are the problems of time zones.
Yeah. Anyway,
yeah, this episode we are not going to be talking about time zones. We're actually going to be talking about the one and only George. We've done Lucy, we've done Lockwood, so of course it's George's turn now. We've got to do George, we can't get away with it.
we wanted to do George. We did. We were going to do Kipps, but then we were like, oh my god, this is unacceptable. We haven't done George yet. So here we are, paying homage to the one and only beautiful researcher of Lockwood & Co.
George Cubbins, Karim.
Whichever is your George of choice.
Whichever's your preference.
Yeah.
Or a combination of them, which I
do love kind of smooshing them together. I tend to write George Cubbins, but he cooks curries.
To be honest, there's not many things that are more British than
It's
cooking
true.
curries.
It's a national dish.
Anyway, George, as we all know it, is a great lover of books. And before we really dive into this episode, we're going to give you a 20-second clip about books.
Hey guys, this is Katie from the New Year New Books donation team, and I'm here to remind you that you have until May 7th to get those donations in and help make an impact in your community by donating books you love to organizations that need them. Please reach out to any of our social media pages for any further information, and don't forget to log those donations. Happy reading!
So if you can, remember to help them out with that initiative, because help them out, help us out, help us all out, okay? Like, more people who can read in your community is a great thing. Just look at politics and what's happening on the world stage if you really want to ask yourself why that is. Now, anyway, between now and May the 7th, we're going to be giving you little reminders and updating you on stats and what's going on. Apparently their goal this year is to beat the numbers that they got for last year. So you can look forward to that. Okay, without further ado, we did say that we're going to talk about kind of a smash up of Cubbins and Karim's, but somehow I got chosen as episode lead for this one. I may have... Did I?
You said you wanted to do it, yes.
I don't recall that, so it didn't happen, and they're lying. Majority means nothing. Listen, I'm hosting, it's a dictatorship, so... Anyway, because Tash is leading, and there are 5 books of Cubbins and only 8 episodes of George. Wait, 8 is a bigger number. Wait. Never mind. Anyway, the books are longer than the TV show. There is more Cubbins than there is Karim, and also I happen to like Cubbins better. So we're mostly going to be talking about Cubbins. But I know that everybody seems to love Karim, and actually, to be honest, I kind of do too. Yeah. So let's start talking about George Karim. Who is George Karim? Karim, isn't it?
I'm trying to remember how it's said. And now I'm second guessing myself. I think Kareem.
Karim.
I think it's Kareem.
Karim?
I think
Yeah,
it's
Karim
Kareem.
sounds...
Well, Lockwood says Kareem, but then, Sloane Ranger accent. What does he know?
Yeah, I'm going to say Kareem because that's what Lockwood says. And I am a big Kareem fan as far as him on the show. But there are some
It's the curly hair, isn't it?
I love the curly hair, I do. And I mean...
And the doe eyes.
The doe eyes, and I do love the cooking. Like, the food looks so good. It sounds so good. But, and I mean, those are honestly some of the biggest differences. The number one difference is obviously heritage. George Cubbins is a white man. George Kareem, his family is from has a Persian background. So, and that also feeds into the cooking that he does on the show. He's also into stress cleaning, which is something I can relate to deeply as a stress cleaner myself. So,
there are like questions about those, I always think, though, because the cooking and the cleaning, he kind of takes on a lot of Holly's roles.
he really does, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know where the show is going to go in the future. Obviously, we can't read Joe Cornish's mind, but
Mr. Cornish, if you happen to be listening, we would love to have you come on so that we can pick your mind about it.
yes, we can ask you.
We're normal and can be trusted.
Exactly.
But anyway,
But if he was on here, we could ask him if the plan was to kind of write Holly out of the script because so many of her responsibilities got put on George. It's hard to say.
I doubt it. Like, I don't think the Hollow Boy conflict could have worked without Holly. I mean, I suppose, yeah, maybe it could. I doubt it, though. I feel like it's unlikely just from an optics level that they'd write out one of the only other female characters, particularly a person of color.
Exactly.
I was going to say they could have made Kip's female, but actually Kip's is already in there.
Yeah.
Though I think the Hollow Boy conflict could have happened because they've got a bigger focus on class in the show than they do in the books, and Lockwood is much more of a middle class toff in the show than he is in the books.
True.
Yeah,
So maybe that was gonna be. I think it's weird though. No, you need Holly, don't you?
I think they need Holly. And maybe she and George were just going to bond about cleaning and cooking, which frankly, George needs that. So I'd be fine with that.
She's such a loved character, too.
I mean, maybe Holly would have taken on the aggressiveness that George Kareem kind of lost in the show.
Yeah, George in the books is much more aggressive, for sure. In the books, he is the one who picks the fight in the library with Kipps rather than...
Lucy does it in the show.
Yeah, Lucy does it in the show, but George is just as much a part of it.
Like, they both pick, like... I actually can't quote the line that Kareem says there because it would just have to be censored. But, you know, this is a library, Kipps, not a brain gallery for... Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's an interesting example, but there's also other parts in the show where lines were given away to Lockwood or to other characters in the books. They're George's lines. So, I mean, some of that always happens in an adaptation, but it definitely did change his character a little bit. And there are other
He's a lot
changes as well.
softer in the show. He's a lot softer in the show, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love how acidic and acerbic Book George is. And he also, I mean, some of his more heroic moments got shifted a little bit, you know, so George getting to be the hero at the end of The Whispering Skull, like with there's that whole thing about him, the lenses falling out of his glasses, so he doesn't actually see what's in the mirror, which, I mean, I've seen people say, you know, that's like, it works in a book, but like on screen, it might just look cartoony. But all the same, it is a shift, like making that Lucy's kind of moment of victory as opposed to George's. And, you know, there's other things that, like, big moments he has, and that, like, you know, he's cut out of the Black Library scene entirely. Like in the books, that's George's idea. Like, well, I think George and Lockwood kind of come to it together. Like, Lockwood says it's a possibility, and they go, "Nah, we're not going to do that."
Yeah, George is like, "No, we're gonna die. Yeah, we're not doing it."
Yeah.
Yeah, George sees the guy who fired him get steamed and goes, "Now we're robbing that library." So, you know, it's
It's a great move, frankly.
It is, but it's just, you know, Kareem doesn't get those moments. But I do think, I mean, always with the show, it's worth remembering that they presumably had other arcs planned, and we only got to see the start of the arc, so we don't really know where they were planning on taking the character, if maybe he would have gotten more of those kind of big hero moments as the show went on.
That's very, very, very well put, May. Yeah, we really don't know exactly where they were going to go with it. One of the things, it's a little bit off topic, but one of the things that I've really enjoyed about doing this podcast is, as a bit of a book purist, I have come to appreciate the show more and more and more, because the more we rip it apart, the more you see the little seeds that were planted and that were nurtured in the show that was setting up these character arcs in series 2, series 3. We just never got them.
Yeah.
I know.
And I mean, it's definitely something that when we do our book versus show bit that we'll talk about more. But yeah, I always, I can't claim credit for that line about the arc's not being complete. There's a friend of mine, Daphne, who always says that to me whenever I start like going, oh, but the show changed too much. She's like, well, you have to remember this. I'm like,
Right.
yeah, you're right. You're right.
One big thing that they changed in the show is that they slimmed Kareem down a lot.
Did.
You know, George was, I mean, he's a bit of a punchy boy. He likes his food and he doesn't really care. And I do think it's kind of a shame that they actually slimmed him down, because there's just not a lot of positive representation of characters with larger bodies in the media. And George is honestly, I mean, he's a very smart guy. He's not the comic relief. In the books, he's more of an action hero. You know, how often do you get to see an overweight character swinging the sword and saving the day? It's not something that happens a lot. It's like Maui. That's kind of your only representation. And then Maui's kind of, he's got that islander build, which is a whole thing in itself.
Yeah, I do kind of mourn that loss of George as a larger character in the books. However, I do appreciate the other additional diversity that they integrated into his actor. And I mean, the performance was incredible in the show. I think we can all agree on that. And I wouldn't change that for anything.
Absolutely. I mean, part of me thinks they could have just put him in a fat suit. But honestly, I mean, I think it says a lot about Ali's performance as George. And I am a person who has railed online over and over and over. Like, if anybody's in the Discord servers that I'm in, you just search like Karen versus Cubbins or Cubbins superiority or something, and you will just see me writing freaking essays, okay, about how much I dislike some of the changes they made to George's character, which again, I'm coming around to after doing this damn podcast. But despite that, you know, I look at Ali walk into like the library at Portland Row and I go, oh, that's George. He is immediately recognizable as George. He doesn't look like George in the books. He doesn't even act quite like George in the books, but he is immediately recognizable as him. He just embodies the character so well and transmits that so well on the screen.
Moment.
It's iconic.
And yet it's just so George. It's a two cakes scenario. You know, there's two versions of the character. You can get angry about one version not being there on the TV show, but at the end of the day, we now have two versions of him, and it's great.
A quick explanation there for the two cakes, because I do know some people who listen to this podcast who aren't actually active in fandom, or who are active in fandom and not on Tumblr. There's a little comic where somebody brings over their like messily made decorated cake and tries to put it on a counter and goes, oh no, because it's right next to a cake which looks really gorgeous. You know, oh, my cake's not as good as that. And then someone else comes along and goes, yay, two cakes. And more is better. Sometimes more is better. And honestly, between Cubbins and Kareem, is one of them less well decorated than the other? Not really.
No, it's just different. They're not really, I don't know, they're not really comparable. Like how do you measure which is more enjoyable to see on screen, you know?
Yep. He really gets to the essence of the character in some ways.
Which again is so weird. You can't compare them because they're so different, and yet you look at Show George and you go, oh, that's George.
The rest is mostly the
But
same, though. Sorry. You say
It
that now.
is, yeah. The rest is mostly the same, isn't it? I mean, Kareem's a little bit nicer to Lucy at the beginning than Cubbins is.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's kind of like, there's a Watsonian and Doyleist explanation there. So maybe the in-universe one, the Watsonian one, might be, well, Kareem's a bit older than Cubbins. Like, all the characters are aged up. So maybe he's more mature. And also, he appears to have more siblings, maybe. We don't ever hear Cubbins mention siblings, but Kareem has at least 3 siblings. So there's, you know, only child syndrome, maybe, in George Cubbins. But the kind of outside the narrative explanation, the Doyleist explanation, could be that just given the compressed space in the show, it would be very hard to have George and Lucy going from their initial high level of hostility to like that ultimate closeness that they have and still keep it realistic. Because in the books, they're still having these violent screaming rows once a month in the first book. So it would be very hard, I think, to get from that to the whole, you're the best of us speech in an 8-episode show, and it's already very packed full of like plot and character dynamics. So maybe that's why Kareem's a bit nicer.
That's a really good point, actually, because I just realised that generally in a TV show, when two characters start off that much, I want to say in love with each other, I mean in hate with each other. When they hate each other that much, normally one of them almost dies and the other one like risks their life to save them.
I mean, like, George does almost die and Lucy does risk her life to save him, but they're already friends. I see what you mean.
They're already, by that point, I think she says they haven't thrown pots and pans at each other in months in the books. So, and in the show, obviously, they bonded before that as well.
So, no, I mean, I think there's, you can see if you, like, take a little step back from the show, you can usually see, given the constraints of filming and the space that they had to make this, you can see why they made the choices that they made.
Okay, so you did mention that in the show he has siblings. He has 3 siblings. I think it was engineer, and weirdo, wasn't it? And what's kind of really interesting about that is almost the largest chunk of backstory we get about George at all. In 8 episodes and 5 books put together, that little scene is probably the most we ever find out about him. We do know some things about his background. Most of it we kind of have to infer. The first thing we find out about George, aside from the fact that he's Lockwood's deputy, is that he worked at Fitz for 6 months before he was fired. He's an excellent field agent. Lockwood says, Fitz values presentation and discretion, something like that. And yet they put up with George, who has neither, for a whole 6 months, because that's how good he is. But how did he get to Fitz in the first place? That's something that we kind of all have little opinions about. So what do you think, May?
I mean, for me, what I read it as is like a curiosity. Like, that's the driving force of George's character. So he, from what we know about ages and timelines, he's about 15 in the Screaming Staircase, and he has been with Lockwood, like, living in Portland Row, we think, for about, I think he says it's about a year at that point. And presumably he was at Fitz for 6 months before that. So that puts him about 13 and a half starting at Fitz, which is quite late. Lucy started at the age of 8. Now, we don't know, he could have worked at other agencies before that. We don't know, we're not told. But assuming that we're not told, because he didn't work at any other agencies, my theory is that he wanted to be an agent because of this driving curiosity of his, and this was the best way to get access to all the research without having to go through university and wait for stupid things like degrees. So I think that's my little theory on George, but I have to admit I'm not terribly attached to it. I don't get hot under the collar about it.
Okay, all right. So my theory is completely different to that. It is that, looking at the timeline, Lockwood also says that him and George are both fully qualified. They got their qualifications the year before. So they opened the agency 4 months before the interview, and then they both qualified the year before. If he worked at Fitz for 6 months, there's no way he went through 4 grades while he was at Fitz or just after. There's just simply not enough time. And I think a lot of agency work as well. I mean, it's an apprenticeship, isn't it? Grade 1 and 2 is your apprenticeship. Those are your traineeships. Once you've got your grade 2, I think you can be a field agent. Or once it's 3, isn't it? 3 is when you get your APR. So it's 1, 2, 3 is the apprenticeship. He must have done that somewhere. I think he probably did that somewhere else other than Fitz. I tend to think that he's actually quite working class and that he did it for the same reason everyone else goes into it, which is, financial pressure. But he then discovered, he's got a talent for research. He really likes that, and he edged towards that side of things. But he's obviously very well trained in the field work, which means he's had a lot of time out in the field.
Well, I'll jump in with some thoughts unless you have more. I mean, if we go with the idea that George comes from a family of engineers, as put forth in the show, that is a certain kind of, that speaks to the fact that his family might be quite academic in nature. So to me, that does kind of support some of Mairead's thinking that George has kind of this natural curiosity. So I guess I want to kind of marry your two theories, which is that even if George's family is working class and he became an agent in part to make money, I think he always did have a lot of this natural curiosity too. And then maybe the more he was exposed to the agency world, the more he got interested in like digging into the problem, partly because maybe his family had encouraged that side of him as well. So even if they didn't think he was taking it in the most practical direction, as we saw on the show, that they still kind of gave him that solid academic, intellectual basis to move into research.
What you say, you're mentioning the engineers, and that's actually really interesting because engineers are normally seen as a middle-class profession. But personally, I tend to think of George as very working-class coded. Even in the show, I mean, he says that he's never been outside of London. He's only been to Sidcup. And this might not be common knowledge for somebody who's not in London or for somebody who's not in a diverse area of London, but I am. Generally, working class people who are an ethnic minority, they may have spent all of their time in London. It's actually not super uncommon. Because generally, like, white British people will have family out in the villages, in the smaller towns, so you go out there for the holidays. Whereas, you know, black and minority, it's BAME, I think it's black and minority ethnic populations, something like that. Anyway, you know, ethnic minorities generally are descended from immigrants who are normally in the last couple of decades, which means they came here initially to work and they settled in big cities. So they may have very large extended families, but they're all in the city. So the holidays, they don't go out, you know, they don't get a train for 4 hours to go out into the sticks in the middle of nowhere. They go to the next, like, borough over and celebrate at grandma's house over there. So it is actually a thing. I remember it coming out. Anyway, so that is a thing. And also, in the books, Lucy says that George's mum comes over. She's very lovely and she calls Lockwood ducks. And that is just such a working class thing to do. Like, okay, I'm not saying that middle class ladies aren't lovely, because they are, but middle class ladies don't go around calling people ducks. You know, it's not pet, it's not ducks, it's not lamb, it's not sausage. These are all things that we'll call people, okay? It's more like darling or sweetheart, or, you know, it's your typical terms of endearment instead of the weird ones that we come up with in Britain. So those two things, to me, make me think that, oh, George is very working class. But one thing that is not super working class, which may be surprising to people who, I don't know, I don't want to say who aren't working class British, but who maybe don't know much about it, is, you know, George not caring at all about how he presents himself. He doesn't care if he's dressed sloppily. He doesn't care if his pants is falling down. He doesn't care. He just doesn't care. And there's a very big thing in Britain in the working classes, particularly like in the older generations, that your presentation is extremely important. Maybe it's because it's all you've got, so you have to appear neat, but like these are the people who are ironing like their underwear. Okay? If I'm sorry, but if you've got money, you don't iron your underwear. Yeah. But they're only ironing it because they think it's necessary, because their mothers iron theirs, because you had to be completely neat as a pin. You know? You have to be neat as a pin. You have to show your best self to the world. I suppose it's because it's all you've got in some ways. Maybe. I'm not sure. And being very house proud is another very working class thing as well. Which actually, Kareem in the show is rather house proud, isn't he? Anyway, you want to move on to Lucy?
Yes, especially Book Lucy makes a lot of comments about the way people look and the way people present themselves. But one really interesting bit about George's background, I think, in the show is that conversation that they add between him and Lucy when they go to get Italian food, aka pizza, which I just love that detail. But he talks a lot more there about his background, and that's where we get the quote about engineer, weirdo. And you really see in that how much he's been rejected, and that really adds another layer to his character that we don't get as explicitly in the books. But because he's been rejected, that's why he doesn't care as much about how he presents himself to the world. It's why sometimes we see that he's jealous of Lockwood. And it's also why we see that sometimes he is slow to accept new people. because he's afraid that they're going to reject him. So he's kind of rejecting them first. And it takes him a while to warm up to them, which we see throughout the series.
When you say jealous, like you mean jealous as in jealous of other people having...
Yeah, not envious. Yeah. We mean jealous as in the actual like dictionary definition.
Yeah, sorry. No, I'm having a moment of, did I understand that right? Anyway, yeah, I definitely agree with that he's someone who's experienced a lot of rejection. I think we can see that from the outset when, you know, after Lucy's interview, she kind of says to Lockwood, basically, why the hell do you put up with that guy? He's so rude. And Lockwood tells her, well, he hates two-faced people. He would much rather be straight to your face, even if that means being mean and rude, rather than, you know, going behind your back. And from what we know of Fitz, it definitely seems like the kind of place where there would be a lot of gossip and infighting. Like, Kip's way of thinking suggests that it's a very status and appearance-oriented place. So you can see someone like George suffering a lot there, actually, even if maybe he wouldn't show it. He would probably have gone through a lot of rejection and nastiness just because he refused to get in with that, like, appearance culture that Fitz so clearly has, which comes down from the top because Marissa's obsessed with her appearance as well. But yeah, I definitely think that there's, interpreting George as someone who's used to being rejected helps you make sense of his character in a big way.
It both helps you to make sense of his character in a big way and to make sense of the relationships that are so foundational to his character. George is somebody who he's introduced to us as somebody who kind of doesn't have any relationships in a way, but you very quickly realize that that's not quite true. He strikes me as somebody who kind of hoards people. You know, like when we say he's jealous of Lockwood, he's jealously hoarding Lockwood. He's not, you know, he doesn't want to be Lockwood. He probably can't think of anything worse than being Lockwood. But he doesn't want anyone else to have Lockwood, does he?
No.
He's a little bit like a dragon on his like pile of gold. But anyway, the first main relationship that we see George with, and the first person who we really see him hoarding, is obviously Lockwood. He doesn't give a fig about Lucy when he meets her, but Lockwood he cares a lot about. And I know that Mairead has an awful lot of thoughts about this, so settle in.
Is there anything I don't have an awful lot of thoughts about? Well, actually, there probably is. Taylor Swift. I have no thoughts about Taylor Swift. I'm sorry.
Meg's burst at the scene because she has lots.
Yeah. The rest of us have plenty of thoughts, so we'll make up for your lack. But not this episode. That's
well, I do love thinking about George and Lockwood because I think actually they're very sweet together. You know, they're not codependent, but I think they're the ones who start out together, and it's funny to think of what they must have been like before Lucy joined, because that first year where they're both barely socialized, like they're both used to being loners. Lockwood because everyone he loves dies, and George because of the whole rejection thing. So George is used to being thought of as a weirdo, and I think, you know, he's used to not having anyone value his skills. And then we have Lockwood coming along and saying, yo, yeah, that curiosity you have about the world. Like, George got fired from Fitz for asking too many questions, and Lockwood's like, yeah, actually, your curiosity is an asset. It's not an annoyance. So that must be so validating for George. And I think, Lockwood does this for a lot of people. He's the first person to properly see George in the same way that he's the first person to properly to give Lucy the acceptance that she's looking for.
And I think that really feeds into George's initial reaction to Lucy. As we've talked about a little bit already, George he likes to hoard people, and it's hard for him at first to share Lockwood with Lucy because the two of them have become so close over the year that they've had together. And he's probably, like I said, afraid that Lucy is going to reject him. So he's afraid that also Lockwood might be replacing him. It's normal insecurity in many ways. And for a long time, the two of them have just been doing cases together. And Lockwood has been relying on George to be his listener. And then Lucy steps in, and she's a much better listener than George is. And that is a hard kind of thing as well, because it feels like he's not only being replaced maybe in their house, but also being replaced
he
in the
literally
field.
is being replaced in the field in that sense, isn't he?
Yeah. She's a much better agent than he is. She has a lot more talent than he does. And while he's probably in some levels excited to spend more time on research, it's hard also to give up a role that you've really settled into with another person. And especially when, Miss Lucy Carlisle steps in and she can be so reckless and impulsive, which kind of can influence Lockwood to kind of, his worst impulses at certain moments. And George is much more cautious, and that makes him nervous.
There's that, the ghost underneath was it a yew tree?
Yes, in the screaming staircase when they're kind of at their bottom of the barrel moment.
Yes, and Lockwood moves closer, and Lucy gets annoyed because George throws a flare or a salt bomb or something at the ghost, and she says it wasn't necessary. But, because she's willing to take the risk, George was not willing to take the risk at all. The ghost hadn't moved, he doesn't care.
Yeah, George is very defensive of Lockwood, and they also seem to work together. Obviously they work together, but they work together on a level that maybe Lockwood and Lucy don't, because George is very supportive of Lockwood at like a strategy level. There's that moment where Lucy overhears them in the Hollow Boy, and it's clear that, they're talking about how things are going in the company, and they're planning it out, and George is trying to give him advice. And so, it's, I think...
TCS, that bit in Oldbury Castle, where they split into teams, and George takes Holly and Lucy and is like, okay, one of us has to lead, who's going to be, and makes them decide.
Yeah.
That all just smacks of...
pre-planned.
Yeah, it was entirely pre-planned.
Yeah, 100%.
They were sitting together on the train going, how are we going to make the girls work together? And George just like, okay, you had your moment at Akesmere's, you messed it up, I'm doing it. But then, Lockwood is protective of George as well. Like, there's the moment in The Empty Grave when George gets hurt and Lockwood goes absolutely mental. He's like, okay, gloves off, everybody, we're committing crimes. And he's also so tender with George in that moment. Like, he puts him in his own bed when he's injured, and he stays up all night to look after him. And, it's just such a sweet and gentle moment between two boys who are fairly rough with each other sometimes.
Oh, they always are, aren't they? They're just absolutely awful to each other constantly. What does he say when George comes down the stairs wearing his dinner jacket for the fixed ball? George, you'll have to do.
Lucy, you look delightful. George, you'll have to do.
That's it. But then, he does things like, Lockwood's got that. It was 48 hours. It wasn't just one night he stayed up.
Yeah.
He stayed up solidly 2 nights to the point where he was, staggering around the kitchen, unsure where the kettle was when he came back. And it's clear how much they mean to each other, isn't it?
That's really lovely.
It's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, Lockwood even puts him in his bed, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's what I was just saying.
Yeah, I
that,
missed that. Whoops.
when he brings him back after when he gets beaten up in The Empty Grave, he puts him in his own bed, and then Flowbones comes in and
kicks him out of his room.
sleeps in his jumpers.
Yeah, and Lockwood's like, okay, sure, I'll roll with it.
This is happening. Might as well happen.
I guess I've given up my room.
Yep.
It's fine.
But anyway, no, it is they're one of the loveliest relationships in the books, actually. But because, of course, we're seeing everything through Lucy's perspective, you might not notice it unless you're looking for it.
So talking about Lucy's perspective, his relationship with Lucy is quite a bit different, isn't it?
Yes. Lucy and George start out with an extreme amount of conflict. As we've mentioned, there are extreme
across the kitchen with screaming rows, and you just kind of wonder what Lockwood was doing at that point. Like, I know my best friend and my deputy and my employee are trying to kill each other physically. I guess I'm going to go practice rapier drills.
That's exactly what I imagined he did. Yeah, he was just like, they'll sort it out. I'm going downstairs for practice. And they did. And they did. But I mean, they really it took a while. And George was really suspicious of her in the beginning. On their very first case he does with Lucy, he questions her knowledge. He asks her if she knows about spiders, which is like the most basic kind of knowledge about ghosts that exists in this world. which is that, ghosts are attracted to spiders. Spiders are attracted to ghosts.
Is that a chicken and the egg thing, though?
And then he, yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, I don't know which way it goes.
No, it's not. Spiders are attracted to ghosts. I'm just throwing you off. Which George also tries to do to Lucy, doesn't he? He tells her that like some listener went mad and jumped in the river.
Yeah, he's honestly kind of insulting to listeners, and it's pretty nasty. And then when she dares to express an opinion that's different than his about the haunting, he really is suspicious and he questions it. And then, of course, Lucy is vindicated and she's right. But he has some real suspicion of her talent in general, especially the emotional connection part of it, because it's an imprecise science and he doesn't like that kind of vibey nature of it. And he doesn't see it as having as much actual worth. So he's a little hostile to her, especially on cases, even though, Lockwood finds her talented and fascinating, but George is like, I don't know about this. I'm not quite sure about this. And that kind of relates to their general relationship as people for a long time, which is it takes them a while to really prove themselves to each other and to develop a real friendship. But we do say that happens, especially by the time of the Hollow Boy. In many ways, we talked enough about the Hollow Boy in our last episode.
Never want to hear those words
I think
again.
it's safe.
But George was kind of sweet to her during that, wasn't he?
He was really the most supportive friend she had. He was the one who was worried about her. He was hanging out with her. He was like, oh, is Lucy okay? And how does she repay that? She leaves, which is devastating for George because he's already afraid he's going to be rejected and abandoned. And Lucy kind of proves him right. And it's so sad.
And I mean, I think on some level he knows that she left mostly because of Lockwood and Holly and it had nothing to do with him, but she cut him off anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so we really see in The Creeping Shadow where George is the one who's the most outwardly hostile to her. Like Lockwood's everything's great, and Holly is sort of trying, but George is just like gruff. He's he's hostile to her. He's fighting with her after Guppy's house. He's making comments about how is she making more money as a freelancer. He's really kind of vicious, and some of his comments are pretty
personal,
pretty rough. And Lucy takes that. There's definitely, I feel like we've talked about this before, but maybe never actually on the podcast, that there was this element of that where it feels like he's being very protective of Lockwood. It's almost like, oh, you broke, I don't know. It's almost like she's the ex-girlfriend that broke his best friend's heart, and he's acting out a little bit too there.
Yeah.
And we really see in there how much he cares about Lockwood, and he's very clearly chosen a side. Yeah. And that's very obvious, but he's hurt and he's acting out. Lucy's one of the few real friends he's probably ever had up to that point in his life, and she left, and Lockwood wasn't the only casualty. Like their friendship was a casualty too.
Yeah. And it's so hard for George to like be kind of relegated to second place in that. I mean, he very obviously knows that the conflict wasn't his fault. So it really is a rejection of him to be like, yeah, okay, I have a problem with these people, so you're cut off too. Like it's very hard for him. You can see why he's so aggressive with her in The Creeping Shadow.
It is, but we see then, the other side of it is George's loyalty, because once Lucy comes back, he's like, okay, we're good. You're my ride or die again. We're all good. Yeah. And, he just welcomes her back in that moment once she's ready to be there.
He's got one more ride or die that we see, and that one would be Flo, wouldn't it? Who is mostly kind of, their relationship is mostly off-screen in a way, or off-page as it would be, which is interesting because they're kind of like the first confirmed couple in the series.
Yeah, like the whole bit where she comes to nurse him when he's injured in the empty grave. It is very, it's very Florence Nightingale. She definitely shows an interest in him, and like he's very protective of her as well. Like there's that whole interaction they have with Rupert. What's his name? Oh my god, I'm so tired of forgetting.
Gale, Sir Rupert Gale.
My brain is just going Rupert Graves, and I was like, that cannot be right.
me, we would like that.
Yeah. But yeah, he says some disgusting things about Flo, and again, George just ends his career in one of the most beautiful monologues of the entire series. Someday we'll do an episode which is just George's most vicious takedowns.
So, Rupert Gale says, did you want to expand on your statement? And George says, I could, but why expend the energy? We all know what you are. You know it yourself. He took off his spectacles and rubbed them on his jumper. Behind all the flounce and swagger, your moral shabbiness fascinates and appalls you. You can't take your eyes off it, which is why you're so crashingly dull. Oh, and I know the DPRAC rules as well as you. And if you pick fights with accredited agents off about their appointed tasks, Barnes will have your tweedy backside hauled over hot cobblestones to Scotland Yard. So why not go off and hassle someone else?
Just your moral shabbiness fascinates you. You can't look away from it. Go, George, go!
It's so good.
It's delicious.
It's so good.
I mean, that gives a lot of credit to what Skull says, doesn't he? He says that George doesn't really pay any attention to appearances. He looks through to the core of what a person actually is.
It's true. He's very clear-sighted.
And that's super relevant for Flo in particular.
Because Lucy is all very... I wonder sometimes if, like, Lucy looks at Flo and goes kind of there, but for the grace of God go I, because I think, you know, Flo somewhat, she kind of loses her mind after what happens to her, doesn't she? It breaks her. And Lucy could very easily have ended up the same way. But Flo is, yeah, she's always described as oversized Parker, very dirty, covered in mud, very smelly, you know, pulling out tools and implements from unknown reaches and the deepest fathoms and things like that. Like, it's not a very attractive outlook. And George doesn't care. He meets Flo. I think he gets a bit of a shock when he first meets Flo because Lucy and Lockwood kind of team up to tell him, oh no, Flo's a super classy lady. She's wonderful. She's so sweet and delicate. And then he meets Flo and Flo's not. But he seeks her out over the Hollow Boy, doesn't he, to ask for her opinions about the outbreak in Chelsea and her observations and what she thinks. And from there, they slowly build this working relationship, which 2 books later seemingly has turned romantic. It's never said explicitly, is it?
Stroud doesn't do explicit.
But I don't think Flo's showing up at anybody else's bedside to nurse them back to health.
No.
So it's pretty...
Yeah.
It's pretty telling that she was willing to do that for George.
Yeah.
From George talking about Flo, Flo is actually a really interesting one to talk about because I think that she's a really nice symbol of one of George's background glow-up arcs. Personally, I think that George is kind of the king of the background glow-up. It's never really said explicitly because Lucy is Lucy and she only has eyes for Lockwood. You know it. I know it. We all know it.
We all know it.
But the way she describes George slowly changes. For example, in books 1 and 2, she always says that George is shorter than her from book 3 onwards. She never says so. Never.
Puberty. It happens.
Yeah, it happens. So I think he outgrew her at one point. Talking on that, I mean, like, the most visually obvious change that George goes through is actually the fact that he starts out the series as this fat white blonde kid, and he ends the series, according to the book covers, as a dark-haired kid with curly hair who's quite slim.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, who is that? On the cover of The Empty Grave, if you've only seen the American books, maybe you wouldn't know. But the British books have got someone on there. It's Lucy, Lockwood, and some guy.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the process for designing book covers is at all, but you have to wonder how much input, like, the author actually gets on it.
I think not too much.
Very little from what I've read.
Yeah.
Very little. It's all marketing.
That strange person being on the cover of The Empty Grave does open up the possibility of George Kareem actually being George Cubbins' final form.
He evolved.
He morphs.
Anyway, let's talk a little bit more seriously. Like, George is somebody who is constantly growing throughout the series. He really is, and his growth spurts are just super obvious. This could be because he's the most emotionally healthy one. you know, he's got a degree of self-awareness that Lockwood and Lucy really don't seem to have. But then you think, well, if he's doing this whole child soldier thing, maybe he's not that emotionally healthy. Sometimes it's just all relative, isn't it?
I mean, anyone would look emotionally healthy when framed by Lockwood and Lucy. I look emotionally healthy when framed by Lockwood and Lucy.
He has both living parents, as far as we know, which is something Lucy and Lockwood both don't have.
Yeah.
Oh, that's going for the vein, isn't it?
It's true, though.
Anyway, digging through the books for this episode, we've kind of pinned down that he actually has 3 very distinct arcs. And they can be really neatly categorized, which I'm sure George would love. The first one that we see him do is he's got kind of a physicality arc. Then he's also got an emotional growth arc that he goes through, and he's also got an intellectual growth arc. And the last one is where flow really comes into play. But I'm going to talk a bit about the physicality one, because personally that's the first one that I noticed myself when I was reading the books. I don't know why, it jumped out at me. Everybody else seems to notice the more intelligent stuff, but I'm the one who went, oh, this. One of the first scenes that we see with George after the interview and all that, like one of the first contemporary present scenes that we see with George, is Lucy coming back after the hospital, after burning down the Hope House, and her and George have this giant argument in the entryway. And a lot of this is from George's concern for Lockwood and concern for Lucy, though he wouldn't admit that. But, you know, Lucy calls him out because she says, you're never on the front lines. You let us go on the front lines. You're always behind us. Like, George could have gotten a cab to the Hope House, but he didn't. He's always going, you didn't wait for me, you didn't wait for me. But that doesn't mean that he could have gone. He could have gone. He didn't want to go because he's scared. And to his credit, George, at the age of about 15, does something that many grown men and women can't do, and says, yeah, you know what? You're right about that, and I'm going to try harder. And he does try harder. He doesn't miss any more cases. You know, he's obviously still scared, but he goes and he does it. Like at Kensal Green in the Whispering Skull. He's a bit of a drama queen, isn't he? And he's like, oh, my will is in a box underneath my bed, when he has to open up the coffin and all of this. And in The Hollow Boy at Lavender Lodge, he says, oh, I'll open the first door, with this big flourish like he's committing some grand sacrifice. And then he opens one, which is obviously going to be a broom closet.
I do think that there's, on the fear front, like, there is something to be said about being funny about your fear. It takes a lot of courage. So the fact that he's cracking the jokes at Kensal Green and, you know, he's being a little bit funny about the broom closet, it is still a development that takes a lot of bravery to, you know, be like, yes, my fear is there and I'm going to laugh at it. That is a courage in itself, I think.
No, I do agree with that, actually. And I do think it's worth pointing out that neither Lucy nor Lockwood like opening doors or opening coffins or anything.
No, they don't.
All right. They have a very
I mean, it's scary.
It's scary, right? They have a very strict rotation about it, and I always find it entertaining because Lockwood's like, yes, I will die for you, but it's your turn to open the death door, so off you go.
Gotta keep it fair.
But even in the empty grave, when everyone is, you know, their best self, their most competent self, their strongest self, their bravest self, you know, everyone stands around Marissa Fitz's coffin and goes, Bagsy, not it.
They're such kids sometimes. It's very sweet.
They are.
Yeah.
But like all through all of this, you know, by the creeping shadow, back to George, he's wandering around the Ealing Cannibal's house. Lucy describes him, I think, as a grisly real estate agent.
Yep. Telling everyone where the toes were found and stuff like that.
And there were eyeballs in this room, and this, you know, teeth were in this one, and all of this stuff.
That's so creepy.
But what that tells me is that he's walking about a very haunted house by himself.
Mm.
Which I think, you know, book 1 George would never.
No.
By book 4,
No.
George has worked on it. You know, even the thing about coming late at Winter Garden. He's stuck researching late. They don't wait for him. They go to Winter Garden. He meets them there.
Yeah.
So his, you know, this part
His
of
physical
his
courage.
arc. Yeah, he's putting himself out physically, isn't he? You know, he's going to the front lines. He's joining. He's not hiding behind anybody. He's not hiding behind, oh, you guys are better at it. He's going. He's there, and he fights with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really quite a big deal for him, especially because he's always kind of cognizant of the fact that their job is extremely dangerous. And I mean, Lockwood and Lucy are as well. Lockwood more than Lucy, but they kind of deal with it by pushing it to the side. Whereas, like you say, Mairead, like, George is kind of brave enough to face it in a way. I always think it's kind of telling, like, when they do go and rob the Black Library, they walk through the Hall of Fallen Heroes. And he says, yeah, this is the Hall of Fallen Heroes. I always hoped I'd never end up here.
Yeah.
You know, he says something like that, which is kind of like, yeah, duh, of course. But also, for him to say it, it's like, okay, this was on his mind, that it was a possibility for him to end up here.
He's much more aware of his own mortality, maybe, than his own fragility than Lockwood and Lucy are.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not dumb enough to think he's invulnerable. Which kind of, again, like, I think it
It's a
kind
smart
of, again,
person thing.
I'm kind of, again, it's not kind of, again, anyway, but I find it really interesting that by the end of the series, he's the most physically strong person, because in The Creeping Shadow, Lockwood, again, at the cannibal's house, says, we need your strength. And George is the one that's, like, sent to go pull the pipes out and all of that, which means, obviously, he's done some bulking up. Lucy never mentions it.
George got swole.
Maybe he spent the Black Winter lifting weights, you know?
I mean, I kind of wonder if, like, from the Hope House, he didn't maybe start lifting weights or something, you know? Okay, Lockwood's the poncy guy flashing about with his sword. Lucy's obviously got the talent covered, but between them, they've both got spaghetti noodle arms, so...
I mean, yeah. Lockwood definitely lifts. Remember the time in The Whispering Skull when he just picks up the kid by the scruff of his neck? Like, just... So, I think... Lockwood is strong, but I think actually in The Whispering Skull as well, we see George have that physical fight with Joplin, and it's a little bit pathetic. You know, he does, I think he actually does pick him up around the waist and, like, you know, suplex him or something. But it...
George complains about the weight of the skull jar in The Whispering Skull as well.
He does, but he doesn't really cover himself in glory in that fight. I mean, he does fight, but it's clear that he doesn't have the physical stamina for it. So I think you're right. I'm agreeing with you. I think that there's a change by the Creeping Shadow in that George has become stronger. So yes, I love Pumping Iron George. That's the only version of George that I will accept from now on.
Might have to write a drabble about George taking up weightlifting tonight. So
Please.
if that shows up on a...
Dibs, Bagsy, not it.
Yeah, please do. Like, he's getting all of these packages from the Rockwell Institute during the Black Winter, but instead of being filled with instruments, it's a cover, because inside it's just dumbbells.
Yeah.
His room's full of iron.
Protein shakes.
Okay, so that's one of George's growth arcs. As we said, he's got 3 of them. The second one is his emotional arc. And Meg is the lady to talk to about all things feelings.
I guess I am. That's my reputation both on the podcast and in real life. But we've talked a little bit already about George's emotional, relational arc over the series before, which really goes from this suspicion about being replaced as in his friendships and feeling a lot of jealousy towards new people that coming in and, you know, having some flat out hatred towards some people, also known as Kips, to being like, oh, actually, maybe we can be friends, even though we didn't start off on the best note. And we saw that with Lucy, where he's afraid that he's going to be rejected on both sides there. But we also see him open up to other characters as well. After he lets Lucy in, he really starts opening up to Flo. We talked a little bit about their development of their relationship already. But then we also see him do the same thing with Holly and then eventually with Kips. And each time he opens up to someone new, it takes a little bit less time than it took him in the past. And we also see him being willing to set aside some past conflict and even some past grudges through particularly Holly and Kips in those relationships.
Especially Kips.
Yeah, and I mean, Kips is that's really a big moment for George because George holds this grudge from Fitz where, you know, they fired him and, you know, Kip's in many ways for the first 3 books is the embodiment of Fitz. He is everything George hates about Fitz, and he lets him know it in many different occasions. But when Kip's leaves Fitz, I think that's the moment where their relationship really shifts, because George is suddenly like, oh, Kip's now understands what it's like when you're no longer useful to this institution. And they really, I think, maybe they don't explicitly ever bond about it on the page, but I think there is a bit of kinship there between the two of them. As far as George, you know, learning to also let new people into his life.
I think George is kind of emotionally pragmatic, isn't he? You know, okay, I did have a grudge against you because you did this, but you've changed now. So great, we're cool. You know, I think it's,
yeah,
he's very uncomplicated that way. It's kind of awesome.
And that gets back to his loyalty, right? Like, once you're on his team, you're on his team, and he doesn't question it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that's so great about him.
He really is kind of like a sort of a steady core for the team. Like, he's the one who doesn't leave. Like, they all kind of, he's the one in the kitchen. He's the one doing the cooking. Like, you ever experienced how in a household the person who does the cooking is kind of the linchpin of it all? And it's not necessarily always like the mother. Like, in my house, my younger brother does a lot of the cooking, and you know, he just kind of becomes the linchpin person. That you know, that it's like he's the steady one, the one who's always there. So yeah, I love that about George. His steadiness, his loyalty, his reliability, and I think it's very healing for a lot of the characters around him. Like, a lot of sort of flighty, mercurial characters are very attracted to him. Like, Flo is definitely a foil for Lockwood. She's kind of, I mean, she's a version of what Lucy could be. She's also a version of what Lockwood could have been. And the fact that he's very grounding for Lockwood and Flo, I think it kind of says something. But anyway, that's the emotional journey.
Those are very, very nice points. And to be honest, I think those are the kind of points that we could expect from somebody who we're handing the intellectual journey over to. So once again, everybody, grab a drink, sit in. It's Murray time.
Yeah, you know the, like, insert quote from The Incredibles here. He starts monologuing. Anyway, so no, I mean, the whole thing about George's intellectual journey is really interesting to me, because he goes from very much like being sort of a rationality only scientific method holds all the answers to being open to the fact that there are things that we don't understand. So he's on oh god, I have to take a run up at this word. He's on an epistemological journey. This is the price of being pretentious. You have to make an idiot of yourself to say the words out loud.
Well done. We discussed the pronunciation of this before we recorded this episode.
It's so hard. There are so many syllables.
It's a really hard word to say.
Anyway, yeah. But anyway, he's someone who changes his mind about the ways in which it's possible to know things. Like, he goes from someone who's only accepts one form of knowledge to being someone who accepts multiple forms of knowledge. I think it's a really healthy journey for an intellectual.
This journey is really interesting because, like, you can kind of track it book to book. It's probably his biggest and most clear arc, isn't it?
Yeah. I think you can definitely see, we've already said that in The Screaming Staircase, part of his problem with Lucy is that her talent is so subjective and hard to quantify. It's too wishy-washy for him, and he's a cold hard data man. He's just not interested in, ooh, I felt this, I got an impression. You know, he doesn't take that seriously. So moving on to The Whispering Skull, there is a bit of a research versus field agent vibe for a bit. Lockwood and Lucy as the head and the heart, the hands and the heart versus George as the head. And I think that's why Joplin and George kind of have this separate thing in that book, because George wants someone who's like him. But then Joplin double crosses him, and I think that takes the shine off the whole pursuit of knowledge thing for him. Or at least it opens a crack in it. And then if we go on to the Hollow Boy, okay, yes, he uses all the data from all over to crack the Chelsea outbreak. He learns from he gets all this information from Quill, and he uses that to figure out what's happening. But he also relies on Flo and her intuition and her anecdotal evidence. So there's a shift there. He's becoming more open to different sources of data, let's say. And then in The Creeping Shadow, there's a very interesting moment where George goes into Rotwell's, the Rotwell Institute lab, and he sees all these like instruments that are kind of, you know, torturing the ghosts. And he goes, oh, this looks like my own lab at home. And I don't know, I don't remember, because I haven't reread it in a while, if he has any sort of realization there about, ooh, you know, this is...
None at all.
None at all.
There's
Okay.
no time to,
Yeah.
like...
But I think it's very interesting that he starts out this book like buying all of the Rockwell Institute things to test them out. And obviously partly that is because he thinks they're pretty crap. But also, obviously, like the Rockwell Institute is in the pursuit of knowledge and science, and he starts out testing that out. And at the end of it, he finds out the Rockwell Institute is not that great.
Yeah, and he blows it up. I love that line. Next thing, I just saw you vanishing into the circle, and next thing I knew, I was blowing up a perfectly good research facility. It's just great understated George humor. But yeah, it is kind of like a warning sign for George of, you know, this is what you could be if you're not careful. And then
it's another thing where it kind of crumbles a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, just like little cracks. And then I think in The Empty Grave, again, George never really discusses this. So this is all conjecture, but we do know that he finds out that Marissa and Tom were not good researchers. They weren't in pursuit of knowledge. They were in pursuit of power. And yeah, that's, he kind of becomes the real scientist, if you like, the one who's committed to searching out truth rather than just knowledge as power. And also, very interestingly, by the end of The Empty Grave, he's willing to think about the unknown just being the unknown. So there's that really lovely moment after they've come through everything, they've come through the other side, and they're discussing those funny little portals in the other London. And George says that he thinks that there's another London beyond them, like a kind of a brighter, shining London, which is a beautiful image. And Lucy says, how do you know that? And he says, I just have a feeling. So it's quite a dramatic change from hard facts to accepting feelings. And it's not that he ever stops believing in the importance of the hard facts. It's that he also accepts the validity of intuition and emotionality as a way of knowing the world. So I think it's a very relevant journey for today when, you know, we like to think of ourselves as such a hyper objective society, and yet we're more emotivist than ever. So it's very balanced, it's very lovely, it's well done. It's worth learning from. Sorry.
No, thank you very much for that, Mairead. I'm just trying to think of what I could possibly say to come along and summarize that would actually add anything, because that was incredibly well stated.
Yeah, not bad for 12 in the morning. 12 at night.
Not bad at all. Well, those are our 3 arcs that we think that George goes through. Obviously, I think the intellectual one is the biggest one for George, because like Mairead, you said so lovingly and in such a lovely way, you know, George is the head where Lucy is the heart and Lockwood is the hand.
Mm.
So George's main arc is always going to be about...
It's going to be about knowledge, but it has to be, like, he learns not to be separated and divided within himself. And so, you know, maybe Lucy and Lockwood are the heart and the hands respectively, but he picks up these qualities as well. And it's a journey he might not have gone on if he hadn't had Lucy and Lockwood. Like, he could have been part of the problem very, very easily. We see, like, his thirst for knowledge spurs him on, and it actually damages him in the Whispering Skull. Like, it really causes him a lot of problems. And, you know, you could see how in another world, without Lockwood's influence, Lucy's influence, George could be doing terrible things in pursuit of knowledge and claiming that it's impartial, it's just science. So in a way, Bickerstaff is George's dark mirror. Like all the characters have these foils and these mirrors. Stroud is insane for that.
Multiple ones, don't
Yeah.
they?
Oh, there's so many. It's amazing.
all of these characters are just so multifaceted. It's
Yeah.
like we may end up doing another George episode at some point because we just seem to be focusing on one. We learnt from the first Lucy ep, we need to focus on one aspect of each character at a time because there's just so much to them.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing about Bickerstaff as a foil for George is he probably didn't start out like mutilating corpses and robbing graves, but that's where he ended up for the sake of knowledge and power. It's very easy, if as scientists, to get sucked into that kind of dynamic of knowledge as power. And like we do see George do some kind of ethically dubious things, like conducting experiments on a sentient being. Like, okay, he didn't know that the skull was sentient, but like he's semi-sentient. Like, you know, he's burning him in the oven.
I mean, he knew he was sentient at that point.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
He did. He was putting him in the oven to try and force him to talk. So he definitely could have gone evil mad scientist with like the right coaxing and the wrong influence. He could become something terrible, which is also true of Lucy and Lockwood. But the thing about George is that to defeat this like knowledge as power arc, he had to embrace love. He had to embrace emotion, intuition, feeling, and doing good for the sake. He has to embrace learning for the sake of saving, like as a gift for other people. So he's not just a scholar ultimately, but a pursuer of the truth. And I can't claim credit for these thoughts. I'm actually quoting a friend of mine, Lilac, who's very, very smart and big-brained. Thank you, Lilac, for these lovely thoughts.
But I think that really gets to things we talked about in other previous episodes, where the big journey for a lot of these characters, Lockwood included, is learning about the importance of relationships. And so this is kind of just another way to show that that's really one of like the morals of the books. One of the big themes is,
Absolutely.
you know, it's about the friends you make along the way.
The real treasure was the ghost we put in the oven along the way.
And on that note, that is certainly all we have time for this episode. Thank
more
you
than
very
we
much
had time
for
for.
joining us and listening in. We do have more episodes in the works, obviously. You can find us several places in social media, which is normally Meg's job to rattle off, but she's just kind of looking away from the camera. So I guess it's mine this time.
They're in the show notes. You can find us all the places.
We trust that you guys can read.
Yeah.
Yes, you can find us all the places. You can email us. You can find us on our website. We're also we've joined the bluer skies of the internet. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night.